Hello everyone, I'm Koirala. So today I'll be talking about trade liberalization and economic reform in developing countries, structural change or deindustrialization. So without any further ado, let's get into the presentation. And the very first slide is about background. Trade liberalization involves removing barriers to trade between different countries and encouraging free trade. Trade liberalization involves reducing tariff, eliminating quotas, and reducing non-tariff barriers. The process of trade liberalization and market-oriented economic reform that had started in many developing countries in early 1980s intensified in the 1990s. The reforming countries can be classified into three groups. The first group consists of a number of countries in East Asia, which continued their own dynamic industrial and trade policies initiated in 1960s. The second group includes a large number of countries, mostly in Africa, which have gone through the reform programs designed and dictated by the IFIs. The third group comprised a number of Latin American countries that undertook economic reform since early 1980s, initially under the pressure from IFIs. Trade liberalization measures in particular are believed to be a reason to the failure of traditional import substitution (MC) policies of the 1950s to 1970s. The philosophy behind the reform program was that the role of government in making decisions on resource allocation should be minimized and the incentive structure should change in favor of exports through import liberalization in order to follow an export promotion path instead of MS. So now let's get into another slide which talks about evolution of the old bank's approach. The work of the old bank on trade policy and economic reform has been dominating the field in recent decades. The old bank take neutrality of a trade regime, that is, zero rates of protection for importables and liberal trade regimes are as synonymous. Old Bank recognizes for the first time that economic policies and policy advices must be country-specific if they are to be effective. Importance of country-specific policies are recognized. They advocate almost a universal trade and industrial policies for all developing countries during the process of their development. They advocate the government involvement in the economy should be limited to functional, not selective intervention. The success of the East Asian countries was attributed to their low level of general tariff rate. It is concluded that protection of domestic market coexisted with promotion of export through countervailing subsidies in most East Asian countries. So now let's get into another slide, which is growth in export and outputs. For analyzing the performance of developing countries, some samples are used, which includes three different categories of countries. First, countries which have already developed their individual capacity and have substantial capabilities in export of manufactured goods. Second, countries which have developed industrial capacity through import substitution with some export capabilities. Third, countries with little industrial base which are located mainly in Africa. Growth of export are inflated by increase in import intensity of export in recent years due to import liberalization and changes in the organization of production towards networking and assembly operation. According to rate of growth of purchasing power of export of manufactured goods, sample countries are classified as high, moderate and low rate of growth of export of manufactured goods. So now let's get into another slide, and that is changes in structure of production and exports. The very first topic of it is diversification. A general indicator of diversification of output in favor of manufactured goods is change in GDP ratios. Dependence on external market has increased substantially during last 2 decades. Yet, such dependence has not been accompanied with diversification of output structure in favor of manufacturing sector in all cases, even when manufactured export expand fast. The industrial sector has been more vulnerable to trade liberalization in countries at lower levels of development and low industrial bases. And the second point is upgrading the production and export structure. It is essential for substantiality of exports. It helps technological development and spillover effects of the export sector to the rest of economy. It reduces the vulnerability of the economy to external factors, balance of payment crisis, fallacy of composition, and terms of trade losses. With few exceptions, there has been a major regression rather than upgrading in the structure of products and exports in Latin American countries. The change in pattern of specialization in exports is more or less in conformity with change in pattern of production. So now let's get into another slide, and that is impact of liberalization on industries. Liberalization helps industries that are near the stage of maturity. Even if industries didn't perform well in the expansion of exports of manufactured goods as a whole, rapid expansion of exports of vehicles and machinery, particularly non-electric, are of an exception and interest. Liberalization can be effective in making an industry competitive when it is near the stage of maturity, as it harms infant industries or inefficient industries subject to prolonged protection. Deindustrialization has taken place, which includes high rate of export growth. Moreover, little upgrading took place except for industries which had been dynamic during the import substitution era and near the stage of maturity. Now getting into another slide, which is changes in investment. To create production capacity, that is to sustain export and upgrade its structure, requires investment. It has been the main contributory factor in structural changes and competitiveness (NIEs) in the international market. The interrelation between investment and exports are strong and complicated. Investment is the main factor in growth of exports, supply capacity and upgrading, whereas export can have positive effects on investment through their income effective and supply effects. It is possible that liberalization policies which are pursued to encourage export may not necessarily encourage private investment. FDI does not always contribute to the expansion of production capacity when the inflows is spent on the purchase of existing assets. The allocation of investment to productive activities, particularly manufacturing sector, also suffered from the reform. In most countries, investment environment have been depressed due to change in economic policies despite some temporary improvement during the second half of the 1990s. So guys, this is about changes in investment. So now let's talk about vulnerability of economies. The implication of reorientation of the production toward export for the vulnerability of economy, particularly the manufacturing sector, to external factor are increasing day by day. Export expansion has been accompanied with mounting vulnerability of the exporting countries to external factor. As a source of supply, vulnerability to external markets has increased significantly for the manufacturing sector. Now, getting into debate of deindustrialization. Deindustrialization is the natural outcome of successful economic development and is generally associated with rising living standards. The main cause of deindustrialization is developed countries. Differential growth rates of productivity in the manufacturing and service sector resulting from innovation. Competition of imports from South, relocation of industries to developing countries and outsourcing. Underinvestment in the particular case of Britain, thus disease. Deindustrialization is a premature decline in MVA GDP ratio without recovering. It is due to the reorientation of the production structure of the economy from import substitution strategies toward production. And finally, moving over the last slide of mine, which is conclusion. The analysis of a sample of developing countries in this article indicates that the structural reforms that have been undertaken in developing countries since the early 1980s have shown different results. Rapid export growth was accompanied with fast expansion of industrial supply capacity and upgrading of their industrial base. More importantly, half of the sample countries for which data are readily available faced deindustrialization. Slow growth of exports and deindustrialization has also been accompanied by increased vulnerability of the economy. The reform programs designed by IFIs failed to encourage private investment in general, particularly in the manufacturing sector. Trade liberalization changed the structure of incentives. Nevertheless, the balance between risks and returns in manufacturing activities also changed in favor of residential construction and non-tradables. So thank you guys. This is all about my presentation. Thank you for listening.